The entire executive floor had been awake for 17 hours when the company's most expensive machine finally went silent. Screens went black, warning lights flashed red, and a multi-million-dollar production system that had taken the best engineers in the city 3 years to perfect simply refused to start. The CEO stood behind the glass wall of her office, watching a team of elite experts argue over diagrams they no longer understood. Nobody noticed the quiet man in navy work clothes standing near the service door, holding a cleaning cloth in one hand and a small toolbox in the other. He was only the night cleaner, a single father who had come to finish his shift. But before sunrise, that man would discover something everyone else had missed, and what he did next would change not only the company, but the life of the woman who had once looked straight through him. Before we continue, if you believe kindness, second chances, and never judging someone by their job title can change a life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Bright Heart. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to people who believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The CEO, Elena Hart, had built her reputation on being impossible to impress. At 38, she controlled one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, and her glass-walled headquarters reflected everything she believed about success, precision, speed, ambition, and perfection. That night, however, perfection had collapsed. A prototype automated assembly system in the company's private research facility had malfunctioned just hours before an important demonstration for international investors. 3 senior engineers had already spent most of the night examining it. An outside specialist had flown in from another city. The company's chief technical officer had personally reset the system twice. Nothing worked. Every failed attempt pushed the company closer to losing a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Elena walked into the laboratory with controlled anger, surrounded by people who were afraid to meet her eyes. The machine stood in the center of the room like a giant sleeping animal, covered in cables, sensors, and metal panels. Everyone had theories. One engineer blamed the software. Another suspected a damaged circuit. The specialist insisted that the problem was probably buried inside the main control unit. They spoke in complicated technical language, but Elena could hear only one thing beneath it all: nobody knew how to fix it. Then she noticed the cleaner. He was standing several feet away, quietly wiping dust from a workbench. His name was Daniel Reed. He had been working the night shift for almost 8 months. Elena had seen him before but had never really seen him. To her, he was part of the background of the building, someone who emptied bins, cleaned floors, and disappeared before executives arrived the next morning. Daniel was 35, a widowed father raising his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, alone. Every evening, he left his little girl with his elderly neighbor, worked until midnight, and hurried home so he could be there when Lily woke for school. He never complained about the exhaustion because his daughter was the reason he kept going. That night, Daniel noticed something strange. While cleaning near the machine, he heard a faint clicking sound repeating every few seconds. It was barely noticeable beneath the hum of the emergency fans. He stopped wiping and listened. Click. Pause. Click. Pause. Click. His eyes moved toward a narrow access panel beneath the main console. Years earlier, before losing his previous job, Daniel had worked as a maintenance technician in an industrial plant. He had spent more than a decade learning how machines behaved, not from expensive university laboratories, but from long nights crawling beneath equipment, listening to motors, tracing wires, and fixing problems nobody else wanted to touch. He knew he was only a cleaner now, and he also knew what happened when people stepped outside the boundaries assigned to them. So he stayed silent. But then the machine suddenly sparked, and one of the engineers shouted that the entire system might need to be replaced. Daniel looked at the access panel again. He couldn't walk away. He carefully approached the chief engineer and explained what he had heard. The room became strangely quiet. A few people smiled as if the suggestion were amusing. One engineer told him the sound was probably irrelevant. Another reminded him that the machine was not something a cleaning employee should be touching. Elena looked at Daniel and almost dismissed him herself. But something about his expression stopped her. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't asking for money. He simply looked like a man who had noticed something that mattered. Elena finally gave him permission to explain. Daniel pointed toward a small sensor assembly buried behind the panel. He explained that the clicking sounded like a relay repeatedly trying to complete a circuit but failing because of an intermittent connection. The experts checked the main board and software logs. Nothing appeared wrong. But Daniel believed the fault was farther down the chain, where a connector had been vibrating loose under repeated temperature changes. The chief engineer reluctantly inspected it. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Daniel asked him to move one particular cable by a few millimeters. The system suddenly gave a sharp electronic beep. Everyone froze. The engineer stared at the cable. Daniel remained still. A tiny connector had a hairline fracture. It was almost invisible. The company's best experts had spent 17 hours looking at screens and diagnostics, while Daniel had found the problem by listening. But fixing it wasn't as simple as tightening a screw. The damaged connector had caused a chain reaction that affected several safety systems. Daniel carefully explained how to isolate the damaged section and temporarily reroute the signal without risking the rest of the machine. The engineers followed his instructions, first reluctantly, then with growing attention. For nearly an hour, the laboratory became completely silent except for tools clicking against metal. Finally, Daniel told them to restart the system. The machine came alive. One screen illuminated. Then another. The central control panel turned green. The room erupted in relieved applause, but Daniel didn't celebrate. He simply looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. His daughter would be awake soon, waiting for him to come home. Elena watched him gather his tools. She suddenly noticed how old his boots were, how carefully he folded his work gloves, and how he checked his phone 3 times before leaving. There was a picture of a little girl on his lock screen. Elena asked about her, and Daniel smiled for the first time that night. He explained that Lily had a school presentation the next morning, and he had promised he would help her practice before she went to bed. That sentence hit Elena harder than she expected. She had spent years believing success meant never stopping, never showing weakness, and never allowing personal problems to interfere with work. Yet here was a man who had lost his wife, lost his career, and was raising a child while working nights, and somehow he still had enough strength to care about a machine that wasn't even his responsibility. The next morning, Elena arrived early for the investor demonstration. The system worked perfectly. The contract was saved. But Elena couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. She called his supervisor and learned the truth about his past. Daniel hadn't always been a cleaner. He had been a skilled maintenance technician with an excellent record. After his wife died unexpectedly, he had taken time away from work to care for Lily. By the time he was ready to return, his old position was gone. Bills had accumulated. His daughter needed him. So he accepted the only stable job he could find. Elena realized something painful. Her company had judged a man by the uniform he wore instead of the knowledge he carried inside him. She offered Daniel a position in the maintenance engineering department, but he initially hesitated. He was afraid of failing, afraid of returning to a world that had moved on without him. Elena didn't promise him an easy path. She promised him a chance. Daniel accepted. Months later, he became one of the most trusted technical specialists in the company. His practical understanding of machinery saved the company from several expensive failures, but his greatest contribution wasn't technical. He changed the way people looked at one another. He reminded executives that experience doesn't always come with a degree, wisdom doesn't always sit behind a polished desk, and someone's lowest point does not define their future. Elena also changed. She began walking through the building at night, speaking with security guards, cleaners, assistants, and maintenance workers. She learned their names. She learned their stories. She discovered that some of the people who kept her company running had talents nobody had ever bothered to ask about. And Daniel's daughter Lily. Elena eventually helped establish a scholarship program for employees' children, beginning with families who were struggling to afford education. Lily became one of its first recipients. Years later, Daniel would sometimes tell people that the most important night of his life wasn't the night he fixed the machine. It was the night someone finally looked beyond his uniform and saw the person underneath. Because sometimes life doesn't give you a second chance in the form you expect. Sometimes it comes disguised as a broken machine, a midnight shift, a forgotten skill, or a person everyone else has decided is unimportant. And sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner isn't waiting for someone to save him. He is the person who can save everyone else. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes people deserve second chances, and subscribe to Bright Heart. Every interaction helps this story reach another person who may need the reminder that their circumstances do not determine their worth. And before you go, comment, "Everyone deserves a second chance," if you believe that a person's job